Hi, my name is Will. Welcome to my first tutorial in asset modeling for City Skylines. If you're not aware, City Skylines is a city builder video game where you essentially take the role of a mayor or a deity in constructing and building your ideal city, town, village, etc. There's plenty of tutorials out there that cover the more in-depth aspects of 3D modeling, shading, and animation in a variety of different programs, but I wanted to focus on a tutorial series that would be geared towards low-end hardware, using as much free software as possible, efficiency, low barriers to entry, and simplicity. My goal with this video is to take away a lot of the stigma and fear around 3D modeling and to show that most systems nowadays can create basic models for game engines. Many of the steps you will see in this video are inspired by a Skylines tutorial series by YouTuber KDS Woods. I'll link his profile in the description. That series was extremely helpful for me to cut my teeth on asset creation. So in essence, this is an extended version of his tutorial with modern software versions and rendering techniques. I want to make this video as digestible for you as possible so that you can pick it up and drop it off as needed and skip the parts that aren't relevant to you. So I've decided to break up my video into chapters, so please check the video description for a summary and timestamps. Also, due to the nature of these programs, there are specific settings that I use. Feel free to pause the video when these dialog boxes appear so that you can match my settings. Okay, so the programs we'll be using are SketchUp, 3ds Max, GIMP, and of course, City Skylines. I'm using a mod and a shortcut to make asset creation easier, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. We are going to be using SketchUp for creating the 3D model, 3ds Max for converting it to a City Skylines asset, and GIMP to edit the textures. I chose SketchUp because it's a very simple modeling software and incredibly easy to learn and use. While it doesn't have the functionality of more advanced programs, in my opinion it offers exactly what the average asset creator needs to realize their creative goals. SketchUp used to be owned by Google and offers a free web version that works great. Some of the functionality that we will use is not included in the web version, but they offer free trials if needed. 3ds Max, however, is a paid program, but there might be student versions available. If you absolutely cannot get your hands on 3ds Max, the same functionality of the steps we will be doing, albeit a little more process intensive, is available with Blender. Let's begin by opening SketchUp and creating a model. The first thing we'll see is our 3D space in the viewport. To navigate around SketchUp, we can use the middle mouse button to orbit or rotate our camera. If we press Shift in the middle mouse button, we can pan, and by scrolling the wheel in and out, we can zoom in and out. It might take some getting used to, but in no time you'll be navigating around the 3D space with ease. The next thing to identify is the three colored lines that you see on screen. There's a green line, a blue line, and a red line. The red line is the x-axis, the green line is the y-axis, and the blue line is the z-axis. If you've ever taken a math class, you might recognize the x and y-axes. These are the two dimensions when you say a 2D image, x and y. When you add a z-axis, it adds a third dimension, making the object 3D. At the top of the screen, you'll see a toolbar that has a bunch of icons on it. I've customized my toolbar to only include the features that I use, but you can keep the Getting Started toolbar that comes default with the program. There are also trays, which by default are located on the right-hand side of the screen and allow selection for materials and a couple other options. Okay, we are currently in the default template that comes with SketchUp. This is a metric template, but if we want to switch it, we can click New from Template in the File menu. SketchUp comes with a variety of default templates, mostly in branches of imperial and metric measurements. So you can see one for architectural, landscaping, interiors. We could just use the default metric template since City Skylines is a game created by Paradox Interactive and they're a European company. However, I went ahead and created a 4x4 grid that uses the default 8x8 meter squares that City Skylines uses. If we click on the grid, you'll notice that it turns red. This is because it's locked, meaning that any shapes that we build on top of it are not going to intersect with the grid. So it'll stay static no matter what we build on it. As you can see, each of the squares are 8 meters in length and width. Okay, let's go ahead and build a house. So we're going to go ahead and select a rectangle. There's snap points at the edge of these boxes, so that allows you to snap to endpoints, intersections. We can select the face, and we can also select the vertices or edges. Go ahead and use the push-pull tool to raise the box up to about 3 meters. It's about how high the first floor should be. Doesn't have to be exact. There's no particular order. If you want to go ahead and create your doors and windows first, you can. I'm going to go ahead and do the roof. And I'll do that by grabbing the pencil tool, finding the midpoint of the nearest vertices, and then drawing it and matching the midpoint on the opposite side. Then if I switch to the move tool, I can select that line, that edge, and raise it up. When you raise up, it'll lock to the nearest axes if you're close enough to it, so you can see that it's locking to the blue axis and now the red. So that's a good way of determining that you're going straight up. And now we have a roof. Next, we'll go ahead and create a door. Grab the box tool and create a door. Now this time I'm going to be more precise. I'm going to type in dimensions 1, 2, and that will give us an exact rectangle of a 1x2 door. And you can see that we're not quite lined up in the center, so if you want, you can move it. I can select the move key, select the midpoint of the object, and then drag it to the midpoint of the building. Next, we're going to do windows. Now we could freehand these and just make random squares, or we could use a measurement tool to create a guideline. So by clicking in the very bottom of a line and then dragging up, you can bring up a guideline. You can actually lock it to the measurement that's existing. So we're going to make a 1x1 window, and you see it's perfectly lined up to the top of the door frame. If we select the face, we can Control-C and Control-V to paste it, copy and paste. The problem is it pastes it from the bottom left-hand corner, and it's going to be tricky for us to snap to that guideline. So we could drag and drop it up above, grab the top, and then reconnect it down below. Or we can just grab the face and press move, press Control, and then drag the entire thing over. Oops. So grab the corner, press Control, and it will lock to that line. This is similar with a lot of programs where you can just press move and then hold down the Control key to get a copy. I'm going to go ahead and select and paste the windows on each of the sides. So in total we have 8 windows. I'm not going to be very accurate for our purposes. Okay, so we got a good looking house. The next thing to do is to texture it. We're going to put some materials on it. So we use the paint bucket tool. You can click the paint bucket tool or press B. On the right hand side of the screen in our trays, you can see the categories of materials that come default with SketchUp. So you can see folders that we can select, or you can click the drop down menu and see a list of them. There's brick, colors, roofing. I like to start top to bottom, so we're going to go ahead and select roofing, and we are going to paint some shingles on. These shingles are seamless textures, so they're just a small texture file, but they replicate across the length of the face. And test out some brick. I don't like that. Maybe we'll choose to do cinder block instead. Yeah, this is going to be a cinder block house. So you'll notice that the size of the cinder blocks doesn't quite line up to the roof texture. We can fix that by doing one of 2 ways. We can click on the face, right click, click texture and position, and it'll give us some options. We can move the texture around, we can rotate it or make it bigger. That's our first method. Unfortunately though, if we do that, it only changes that specific face's texture. The rest of them are still too small. So instead we're going to choose to use the second option, which is to modify the texture itself. So if the texture is selected, click Edit, and in the size section you can adjust the size length. So we're going to make this 1 meter. It's locked to aspect ratio, maybe 1.5, and that looks to be about right. So now the cinder blocks are much more accurately sized, and we're good. Next we're going to do windows and doors. So we'll go ahead and grab some glass and some mirrors. That's the category. However, when you paint down glass, it actually shows up as transparent or semi-transparent. And since City Skylines does not render the inside of buildings, that wouldn't work. So instead, what we'll choose to do is grab a color, almost like a green screen element. You can use a blue or a green, something very easy to paint out later. And we're going to use a feature called Shift Click, which will allow us to paint any of that white surface left with the same solid color. So now the windows and doors are painted green. So what we're going to do now is add a texture in for the door. If we don't want it to be green, we can add a texture by clicking the Add Texture button and use the image. I prepared an image beforehand of a door. You can adjust the sizing here or just grab it and then go ahead and paint the door. Now the texture is pretty small, so we can adjust it using the first method I showed earlier. Adjust the position. The position locks to the corner. We can set it to lock to the corner. We can set it to the scale to the corner, and then lastly, the skew or the stretch. We can stretch it down to match perfectly. We don't want it to bend. That looks fantastic. Great. So now we've officially finished our building. One thing we forgot to do earlier is to delete the bottom face. So in the City Skylines, we never see the bottom face, so it's one less plane, one less face that they have to render. Let's go ahead and check to see if everything lines up correctly. We'll use our height scale. Looks good. Looks like she can fit through that door. And then lastly, we're going to go ahead and delete the elements that are not the house. So we'll unlock that grid and delete it. Awesome. Now it's time to save our model. So this part might be a little bit tricky. We have to save a specific file type for it to be read by 3ds Max. We'll call this house, and the default file type is model, but we want to save it as SketchUp version 2020. Go ahead and click Save. SketchUp version 2020 works properly with 3ds Max 2022. So you may have to kind of play around to see which version works with which version of your software. Next, we're going to go ahead and open up 3ds Max 2022. So what you're seeing now is the default viewport for 3ds Max. I've modified it quite a bit so that it has a custom UI that's specific for my needs, which would be City Skylines modeling. So it'll look a little bit different if you're opening it for the first time, but it's the same software, same principle. We've got our X and Y axis visible. It's this plus sign. And if you look very carefully in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, you might be able to see it. There's the green, blue, and red axes that show there. We can navigate this a little bit different, so we can pan using the middle mouse button. And if you want to orbit around the object, you have to hold Alt and then use the middle mouse button. Okay, now that we're familiar with the controls, we can go ahead and import our file that we created. Click File, Import, and find the folder that we saved it in. Saved it into a convert folder, house.skp. Great, now that we've successfully imported our house, our object, there's only a few things that we need to do. First, we're going to go ahead and modify our unit scale. You click Customize, Unit Setup. You want to make sure that we're in metric and that 1 unit equals 1 meter. Press OK. Once that's done, we now need to rotate the axes for the object. So head to the Hierarchy tab. It's the middle one on the right-hand side. Under the Adjust Pivot section, click Affect Pivot Only. And then in the top left bar, select Rotate. And then in the X window down below, type 90, enter. This will essentially rotate the object when we save across the X axis. The next step for us to do is to render to texture. Newer versions of 3ds Max recommend you use the Bake to Texture feature, but by clicking Render to Texture, it allows the UV unwrapping to take place seamlessly as part of it. Click render to texture, and I'm just going to go through some of the settings I have for my renderer and for the general objects to bake, output, bake material settings. Just go ahead and make sure that your settings are matched. They should be default if you're using the newest version that includes Arnold. I haven't changed anything. We're going to make sure that we have the house selected. It's going to show that we're in object channel 3. We don't have any sub-objects, and we have an edge padding of 2. You can increase this number. I recommend maybe 3 or 4. We're not going to projection map, and we're going to leave the rest of the settings the same. It's automatically going to unwrap. Going to minimize that. Next, we're going to add an output. Now, we would typically use a diffuse map. However, with the newest version of the Arnold renderer, it adds shadows pre-baked in, and I cannot figure out a way to remove it. So the best way is to choose an albedo map instead. So go ahead and scroll down and find Arnold_albedo. We're going to go ahead and change the file type and name. You can click the 3 dots, specify the folder you want to save it into. We're going to click the convert folder, and we're going to call this house_D and save it as a PNG. 24-bit, not 48. Now it actually hasn't saved yet until we click render. We first need to adjust the size, so it defaults to 256, and for the house I'd recommend using 1024. If it's a really big building, you can use a large texture like 2048. The last step we need to do is to render to files only. Leave everything else the same and click render. It's going to go ahead and automatically flatten the UV map and assign it to a grid, and then render the texture without shadows directly to the image. Now we can see that we have our roof and our 4 walls and our 8 windows and our door. So this sample image is just the render window. We can open up our folder to make sure that the actual file is indeed there, which we can see it is. If you compare the two, since we had a little bit of padding, there's going to be a slight difference in how far the material is stretched over the edge. And that's a good thing. That will make sure that we don't have any big seams. The next step is to set the channel back to channel 1. So this automatically took place and moved it to channel 3 when we did the render to texture. So we're just going to move the channel back to channel 1. This option is under the modifier tab under unwrap UVW. You'll see the texture on your model get skewed quite a bit, but don't worry about that. The last step we need to do is to go to the far right corner and click on Utilities and find the UVW remove option under the More menu. My UI has it customized, so I've got the box right there, and we're going to want to remove the materials, not the UVW. Keep the UVW the same, just materials. Once you've done that, you can export it. Go ahead and find the folder you saved it in, and we're going to export it as house.fbx. Save. You're going to get an export window, and I'm going to go through a couple of the steps that I've selected. We don't have any cameras, we don't have any lights, we don't have any audio, no embedded media. Shell materials are baked, and then we should already be in metric, but if it needs to convert, you can convert it. And the axis needs to be Z up. Go ahead and click OK. Now that we've exported the file, we can close. And we now have to modify the texture file. As soon as the textures are exported, I like to move them directly to the import folder. You'll notice that I actually don't have a folder that's on the desktop. It's actually a shortcut. I can show you how to create that. You would click shortcut, and you would paste the address into the location box there to create the shortcut. that will allow you to quickly access the import folder in the game files. So bring over the model and the texture file, and then we're going to modify the texture and open it with GIMP. You could open this with Paint if you wanted to, or any image manipulation program, but GIMP is definitely far more versatile. We've got one layer, house _D. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it, and then we're going to create two extra layers for this specific house, one called specular and one called illumination. They're showing up as white, so you can just recolor them black. They should not be transparent at all. I'm just going to rename them. This is going to be our normal map, and then the last one will be our diffuse map. Diffuse means color, essentially, in 3D modeling. Normal is a way of interpreting edges and allows for the game engine to artificially create bumps. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab those green textures we made earlier. There's a tool in GIMP that allows us to select by color. We can set the threshold to make sure only the green is selected. And then we're going to go ahead and select the layer specular. If we do that in that order, it'll allow the actual selection to stay there, and then we're going to fill in those boxes with white. What this does is in game, it will make it seem like the windows are lit up during the night and are reflective as well. The last thing we need to do is go back to the diffuse, and we're going to paint them black. Make sure you have the actual layer selected. It didn't quite completely work, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a paintbrush or a pencil and correct some of the black or the green remnants. Great, so that's all set. Now we're going to go to normal. We're going to use a filter in GIMP called generic normal map. This automatically converts the image to a normal map, which is then used by the system. There's more complicated ways to create it, but this is a really good way that's simple and to the point. The next thing we're going to do is set the levels. So right now, if you set the color levels, they're at 0 with a maximum value of 255 for output. I've created a preset that will set the black to 23 and the white to 140. And I'm following Ronix's guide here that shows every color in City Skylines essentially pops more, so you have to kind of dull them down. So the blacks become a little brighter and the whites become a little darker. You do the exact same thing with different colors as well. Great, so we now have our finalized images and we need to export them. We can go ahead and overwrite the house diffuse map. And then export for normal. It's going to be house _n. And the nice thing about this is it's already in the folder, the import folder, so if we need to modify them later, we don't have to move any files. We can just modify the file that exists in the folder. We're going to do the same thing with specular and same thing with illumination. Although specular and illumination in our case are identical. Now that we have our 4 image files and our model, we can go ahead and open up City Skylines. So from here we could actually open up the vanilla version, but if you're like me and you have a lot of mods, sometimes those mods might conflict with asset editing. So what I did is I created a version of the shortcut that includes a couple extra commands at the end. So there's the original target, Steam apps, and I included the command %, which prevents the splash screen to show, just a personal preference, and then no workshop, no assets with a dash before them. And then even better than that is the mod Load Order tool. This is an incredible mod that will allow you to launch with a bunch of different settings. You can save presets for which assets, which mods you want to load, and then you can change them on the fly as needed. It's pretty great. So for our purpose, we're going to go ahead and go to the Launch tab, select No Assets, No Workshop, and launch. It's a very similar process than the shortcut, but gives me more flexibility and I can terminate the process really quickly. Once we're at the main screen, we would go to Editors, click Asset Editor, click New. We are going to be building a building. And you'll see a list of different categories of templates. So these templates are whatever you want to make your building like. So we're using a residential house as our asset, so we want to find a template that matches residential house. This is a 1x1 building. This is perfect. As you can see, the door faces out past the x-axis to our right-hand side. We want to make sure that our door does the same. There's a little bit of a front yard for this house, and then the roads in the distance. So accurately, our door is facing out to the right. Before clicking continue, you want to check the bottom center pivot, and that lines up where the center of the house is. You can adjust the scale. Some people say to go to 100. I just keep it at the recommended scale, whatever they put. As long as we've kept it metric all the way up to this point, we shouldn't have any issues. You can adjust the rotation too, but there's actually a bug. I don't know if they fixed it, but it messes up the automatically generated LOD, which we'll be using. Go ahead and click continue when you're satisfied. And your house is now in City Skylines. You can tell from the color that it's nice and dull and that it doesn't overwhelm your eyes when you look at it. The bright whites aren't, super, super blinding. We've got reflection in the windows. We can modify the width, offset if we want to, and a bunch of these settings. You can set when the building is unlocked, and you can check color variations. We're not going to. If you added a color map, you could do that as well. You can expand the front yard. Without the front yard expanded, the road would literally be right up to the front of the house, which is, I'm familiar with that living in Boston. And if you have a front yard, this is what it will look like. You can set a toggle to flatten the full area of the house, which would include the yard in front, or just flatten terrain, which would be just under the building itself. You can modify the construction time. We don't have any submeshes, so we wouldn't use that. And then material, if you have color variations, you can show there. We're not using that option. And you can modify where the levels of the building are. So everything's on the ground floor. This is how I think it's supposed to be used. Correct me in the comments otherwise. So I set everything to 0, and then I do floor count. Or yeah, other height would be the top height of the building, and then floor count would be 1. It's only 1 floor. And you can kind of see it like a fake floor that's built in there. It's pretty cool. Now we can go ahead and modify our asset. I'm experimenting with the floors. Can create a door and a parking spot. We can give it some ground texture and populate it with assets if need be. Give it a solar panel, make it a environmentally friendly house. No. We can also add some lights in as well. Definitely recommend you play around and see what options are available in the asset editor. Now we've got this super bright light at night. We'll add a potted plant. Yeah. Add a mailbox, add a grill. And lastly, we're going to take some pictures of it for our workshop. So there's like an overhead view, there's the icon view, and then there's the toolbar view, I think they call it. Once you're ready to finish your asset, you can click Save. We are going to call this tutorial House. You can see that there's folder icons underneath the thumbnail icon and the preview. You can modify these to be whatever you like. I usually keep them the default recommended ones, but you can add in the photos that you took. You can also open the folder and save over those with the same file name and add any photo you would like. Go ahead and click Save. And it's going to save it to your local assets folder. This part's important. We haven't shared it on the Steam Workshop yet. We've only saved it locally. So we're going to go ahead and terminate City Skylines because this version has no assets, no workshop. We're going to relaunch it with assets and with workshop. The mods that I've selected only are for asset editing, so we shouldn't have any difficulties in game. We're going to go to Content Manager, Assets, and scroll down, find the asset we created, and click Share. We can change the description here, and we can also change the photo. And I like to do that because I like how the square photos look in the workshop. So I'm going to go ahead and make a square version of the preview image. The way that I modify it is I open up the preview image in Paint, and I save over that preview image with my version that I created. So there's my version. Here's the preview image. We're going to copy the image over to the preview image, resize it. The exact size that you want is 437 by 437. It's the maximum. And then we're going to save it and close that down. And you'll notice that now that it's saved, it'll look stretched out. When you actually post it to the Steam Workshop, it shrinks it back to the normal size and it looks phenomenal. Now you can see the mod that we've created on the Steam Workshop. It's published. The very last thing to do is to delete it from our local folder and subscribe through the workshop. This is recommended so that you don't have two versions of the asset happening at once. So you can find that through the app data folder. I access it through the import. I go to assets and then I find my tutorial house and I delete it. And then I go back to City Skylines Workshop and there it is. And I'm going to go ahead and subscribe. So what I've just shown you is the entire process from beginning to end. I recognize that the longest part of this would be the modification that takes place in 3ds Max. Fortunately enough, KDS Woods, the YouTuber I mentioned at the beginning of the video, was kind enough to create a script for 3ds Max that will automate that entire process. I've taken that script and I've made a few modifications to the renderer just for the 2022 version, and I'll quickly show you how that script is used. You can find the link to the script in the description, so go ahead and download that. Once you're ready to begin the process, go ahead and open up 3ds Max. Once loaded, we'll need to open the script, so go to the scripting menu and click Open Script. Find the save location. For us, it's on the desktop, and open the script. And you'll see the actual full script listed. We can go ahead and run it from here, or if you're like me and you want a shortcut, you can select the whole script and drag and drop it to a toolbar in 3ds Max. From here, we can follow the same steps as before. We're going to import the SketchUp file. Make sure the SketchUp file is selected, and then click our macro button to begin the export. A pop-up window will appear for instructions to select the SketchUp file. Click OK and click on the SketchUp file again. And then it will ask you whether your asset extends beyond the x-axis. And we can see for ours, here's the x-axis. It does not extend past the x-axis, so we can click No. And it will automatically go ahead and render out those images that we stepped before. It will bring you to an export screen Keep the default settings the same and click OK, and then it will give you a final message that you've successfully exported all the files. Now we can reopen the folder to verify that the two files are properly exported, which they are. And from here we can resume the process to modify our diffuse texture, create our normal, specular, and illumination as needed. If you've made it this far in the video, I appreciate your viewership, and if you enjoyed this tutorial and it was helpful, please let me know by leaving a like or a comment. Thank you for watching.